Hello everyone, it's a pleasure as always to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.6 2nd edition Floor 12 Abyss Guide. With the new endgame on the horizon, I've got a lot more on my plate, so subscribe if you want guides for that too. It seems like it'll be insanely difficult at the harder levels. We're going to skip over the general Abyss tips because I've now made a separate video for that, so if you haven't seen that bit before, go check it out, it's very useful. As always, if you have any thoughts, tips, advice, feel free to add them in the comments and any significant or missing or incorrect information will be pinned. So firstly, let's take a look at the buffs you'll get, the Abyssal Blessings and the Ley Line Disorders. The Abyssal Blessing this time is all about cryo damage. Exactly like last Abyss, we've got another one of those stacking mechanics. This time around, you just need to do 4 instances of cryo damage. When you do those 4 instances, it'll trigger a shockwave at the opponent's location of true damage. Just like last time, it doesn't matter which opponent you hit with this cryo damage. If you hit one opponent twice and another opponent twice, whichever opponent you hit to get that 4th stack, that's where the shockwave of true damage will originate from. And there's a cooldown on triggering this of 4 seconds. Some characters that can trigger this off cooldown on their own are characters like Citlali and Ascofia, as they can do that from off field. Both of their abilities hit once a second, they hit with cryo damage, you're getting full uptime on that buff. On the other hand, if you simply on-field a cryo damage dealer, maybe Ridley or Ayaka, then they can easily make use of this buff, even if they're the only cryo character you're using. This is quite general, as you can fit in cryo characters into a lot of teams. The Ley Line Disorders, on the other hand, are a lot more specific. On the first half, it's very weird. You will get 75% damage bonus on all of your damage when you have 0 energy. Of course, characters that don't have energy and have alternate energy methods like Skirk and Mavuika will get 100% uptime on this. But even though it seems like it, no other characters really make use of this. You might think a character like Xiangling, because she's able to snapshot all of the stats when she uses her burst, she'd have 0 energy during that, and then that buff would go onto the Pyronado. But she only has 0 energy after the burst. The same exact thing applies to Ayaka. You might even have thought that after a character's burst, then surely they have no energy, so they can make use of things. But not only do enemies drop energy when they take certain amounts of damage, characters produce a bunch of energy particles from different abilities, but even just doing attacks on an enemy can randomly generate a tiny amount of energy on your character, meaning it's nigh on impossible for any character to maintain this buff, apart from characters with alternate energy systems. They could have just given Mavuika 75% damage bonus this Abyss and it would have the exact same effect as this Ley Line Disorder. Because as you'll see when we get into the Abyss, you don't really want to play Skirk on the first side. You can already see this as the second side Ley Line Disorder gives normal attack damage to cryo characters. Skirk, when she's not playing the burst version of her kit, makes amazing use of this, as the majority of the damage that she does is cryo damage. Ridley and a Melt team can make use of this, and even Ayaka has some cryo normal attack damage she does. Something I want to say here though for freeze teams is that this buff will have less of an effect in freeze teams. That's because freeze teams that use Ascofia and Farina both contribute a significant amount of damage to those teams. Meaning when you compare this to a hyper carry team, by that I mean one where there's one character that does a massive majority of the damage and the rest of the teammates don't really do anything, in those teams, the buffs on that character that's doing the damage have much more significance because it affects more of the damage. And so in a freeze team, when there's more spread damage, this buff has a smaller effect, so it's not as significant as it seems. That's all the Abyss buffs, so let's take a look at the chambers themselves. As always, we're just going to go straight into the first half. Here we're coming across plenty of cryo-resistant enemies, some with 50, some with 70. And there's a lot of cryo wards or cryo elemental health bars, so you want good pyro application, maybe electro application if you have the team for it. The first 2 enemies we're facing are enemies we haven't seen in a long time. I don't think they've been in the overworld since Dragon Spine, which are Cicin mages. They're placed pretty close to each other, so you shouldn't be too worried about grouping. Before they even cast anything, they have lower interruption resistance, so if you want to stop them doing anything at all, you can knock them about at this point with something heavy, and it'll easily stagger them. And the way that the Cicin mages work is that soon into combat they will summon 3 little Cicins. These are the bug-like creatures, and because they summon them, first of all those creatures drop no energy, but while the Cicins are alive, they will channel energy to the Cicin mages. This allows the Cicin mages to then create cryo wards on themselves worth 8 units. That means you'll need 4 hits of pyro to break them, or 2 Bennett skills because his skills apply 2 units of pyro. On top of that, when you defeat a Cicin, that will deplete the size of the ward on the mage by 2 units, and if you defeat all 3 of the Cicins, then the ward gets completely removed. Though if the Cicin mage is mid-channeling casting a ward on themselves as you defeat the Cicins, there's a chance the Cicin mage will still have the ward afterwards. That's all the main mechanics to them. The one thing I do want to mention is that you definitely want to take a character that's able to hit a couple of enemies at the same time. A small AoE to their abilities is a big advantage. Characters that are only single target, especially someone like Yoimiya, will end up targeting the Cicins, doing damage to them without hitting the mages, and so it can be really annoying to deal with them. Hopefully these aren't too much trouble, and next we're facing the Spiritspeaker. This Spiritspeaker appeared in Abyss not too long ago and is just as deadly now as they were back then. These attack animations are pretty fast, and they do about 10,000 damage. That can be amplified further and one-shot your characters if you're standing in something like a Bennett Burst, as a Bennett Burst will apply pyro to you. Enemies can then trigger reactions off you, just like the Tulpa. Of course, a good way of mitigating this damage is with shield. Geo shields absorb 1.5 times the damage, so they're pretty good, but cryo shields themselves absorb 2.5 times the damage when it's cryo damage, meaning that you get a lot more efficiency out of them, making characters like Citlali and Layla better for mitigating this damage. Anyway, enough about that, let's look at the mechanics. So soon into the chamber, like most bosses, we'll get a main mechanic that starts up. This is where the Spiritspeaker will channel summoning for different clones or reflections, and the Spiritspeaker will then disappear. The reflections have a health bar just like an elemental ward, which consists of 8 units of cryo, conveniently the same as the ones that the Cicin mages summon. These enemies work in a slightly different way to most because they just have an elemental health bar. You can still get particles off them from abilities, but you can't crowd control them, you can't petrify them, or taunt them, or group them. The only thing that does lock them in place is using Citlali or Auron's special interaction. When you do a charge attack with them and enter their special vision, if you target one of the reflections, it roots all the reflections in place and removes 2 units of their health bar from all of them. All the reflections become then rooted for 8 seconds, and you can't do this interaction again until they've become unrooted. Going back to how they work, you can get Arlecchino's Bond of Life on them, you can get Chaska to target them, but because you're not actually doing any damage to their health bars, it's just a ward that they're made of, you can't proc things like Favonius weapons that require you to do damage, nor will coordinated attacks that rely on you doing damage like Daya's skill work. Back to the mechanic itself, as soon as they appear they will spread out quite far, and they'll take turns blinking towards you and performing an attack just like the boss did. This means that because most of them stay away and one of them stays close, attacks with a big area effect like Zhang Ling's burst will still not get great efficiency out of them. You're not able to often hit multiple of them at once. The only time I've found to be able to do this is if I dash over to one of them as soon as they split apart. They will take a moment after they've been summoned to move away, but the one that blinks towards you to do the attack will do that quite quickly, so you end up with 2 right next to you. If you then combine this with Citlali's or Auron's ability to root them, you can root 2 of the reflections right next to each other, letting you deal with them really quickly. The Spiritspeaker is hiding behind one of the reflections, and so when you defeat one of them, there's a chance that you could make the Spiritspeaker appear for about 4 seconds. During this 4 seconds, they still have high resistances, but they'll be paralyzed, and you can proc things like Favonius weapons on them. Though it's only after you've defeated all 4 of the reflections that the enemy's resistances will be reduced. At that time, you'll have 14 seconds to do as much damage as you can to them before they get back up and gain normal resistances. They'll then perform 4 more attacks before doing this mechanic again. There's a whole bunch of efficient ways of breaking the wards of these enemies, whether it's applying a lot of pyro through skills that have a lot of pyro application like Bennett's Skill and Burst, who has double the normal, or just a character that has a lot of pyro attacks and you're able to continually barrage the enemy with, like Arlecchino. You can also break these if you have good Electro application. It'll be a bit slower, but it's more than viable to use something like Chlorand and Fischl. I recommend you test out different characters or go back in my previous guide to see which characters I recommended then, as I went a little more in depth. But as usual, I've included a link to the Genshin wiki giving you information about the amount of elements that different characters apply. And if you want team suggestions, as always, we'll do that at the end of the video. Side 2's boss mechanics are definitely less complicated, but they're sticking with giving us a wave of smaller enemies and then a boss. In fact, they do this 5 out of 6 chambers this Abyss. Here we're just facing 2 Ruin machines. They're quite simple, you can hit them in their weak spots to disable them, that's about all there is to it. After that, we're once again facing the Perpetual Mechanical Array. The PMA has really high physical resistance, so don't rely on that. The main mechanic of the PMA is that when you get it down to between 30 and 35% HP, or after about 40 seconds, it'll start a transformation animation where it becomes immune to all damage. On top of that, you can't get it below 30% damage before you've done this mechanic for the first time. That means if you do get it down to 30%, Use that time to get some energy from the enemy. It will then split into 4 different rune machines, but you only need to defeat the one rune machine with the glowing ring of golden runes around its base to end this phase and paralyze the PMA. 2 notes here are that 1, 2 of the enemies have much higher health than the other 2, the jellyfish and the crab have much higher health than the other 2, and this is randomly chosen, so if you want to retry this chamber to get the ones with lower health, feel free to do that. On top of that, you can manipulate the positions of a lot of these ruin guards so that they're really close to the center of the PMA, meaning that as soon as you've defeated them, you can then instantly damage the core. The crab will generally try to jump towards you, the snake will burrow towards you, the smallest one, this one with a sniper attack called the cruiser, will always dash backwards away from you, so if you stand behind it, you can get it to dash towards the core. And the jellyfish is the most annoying because it will slowly drift over towards you. After you've defeated that marked ruin machine, the PMA's core will then no longer be immune. As we said, it will be paralyzed and have all of its resistances reduced by 50%. You then have about 20 seconds to do as much damage as you can before the whole cycle starts again. Onto Chamber 12-2. Here we're facing another round of smaller enemies into a boss, this time it's 3 Yumkasaurs. The Yumkasaurs are quite nice to fight, there's no mechanics to them, and they will try to chase you down, and so they end up grouping themselves on you. Both the Yumkasaurs and the Mountain King Yumkasaur have really high Dendro resistance. The Mountain King themselves that comes after starts with a pretty dangerous attack. This is the same attack that they'll do if you fail their mechanic. They'll start off with 2 big blasts of fire and then a deadly laser beam. This really hits hard, so make sure to dodge it one way or another. As they're doing these attacks, they will also mark the ground where they hit with fire tracks that will do little dots of damage to you and apply pyro to you, so try not to stand in them. We'll then do its main mechanic where it summons 3 flame grapes. These are 3 fruit that get placed on the ground in front of it. If you hit them with pyro as he's swallowing them, they will explode in his belly, doing 5% true damage. On the other hand, if you apply pyro to them before he eats them, they will explode, doing a significant amount of damage to him and a little bit to you. This external explosion is also pyro, meaning if you have a Hydra or Cryo character to apply that element to the Mountain King, these flame grates when they explode will react for even more damage. If you fail to ignite at least 2 of them, he will then perform that same deadly attack he did right at the start of the chamber. If you don't bring a Pyro character to deal with these, you can get away with it with an Anemo character, as long as they're a character that can use the Pyro on the ground to swirl Pyro. Someone like Kazuha, when he uses his burst, infuses it with the element that's on him, and so if he's standing in those Pyro tracks when he bursts, he will apply pyro to the fruit. The most annoying attack that this Mountain King has by a long way is its spin attack, where it will slowly launch itself spinning over to one side of the arena. If you get anywhere near this attack, you will easily get knocked back, wasting a lot of time. It also makes it very annoying for location-based abilities that he will then move away from, so be wary of that, and you can sometimes delay this attack by standing behind the Yumkasaur. If you're behind the Mountain King, they will turn to try to face you, which can waste a couple of seconds, and maybe you just need those seconds to get that extra damage in. That should be everything for side 1, so let's take a look at side 2. This is the exact same chamber as we faced in 5.5, as we have an Electro Lector into a Millennial Pearl Seahorse. Which means, of course, you'll want really good elemental application to deal with all of these enemies. Pyro, Cryo, and Dendro are all equally effective. Hydra's a little less effective and won't work on the Pearl whatsoever. But let's first take a look at the Abyss Lector. The Abyss Lector has 2 stages to it. First, you deplete its HP down normally to about 20%. At that point, it will become immune to damage and start summoning a ward on itself. It will then summon this ward on itself worth 36 Electro units. This means a normal application of Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo removes 1 unit, and therefore you need 36 applications of Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo. Hydra can be used for this, but it removes it a lot slower. Some of its attacks, any with the Electro Orbs, when you get hit by them, drain energy from your whole party. Of course, characters that don't use energy like Skirk and mavuika aren't affected by this, but your teammates will be. So you can either dodge these, or if you have a shield, that will mitigate the damage and the energy drain won't take place. In previous videos, I've gone pretty in-depth about how different characters apply different elements at different rates. Different characters have different ICD. I think just an understanding that you need lots of Cryo, Dendro, or Pyro will essentially get you through this. Just like before, I've included links to internal cooldowns and gauge data if you want to go look at that below. And if you would rather me give you specific recommendations, feel free to add that below as well. I will say for this Abyss specifically, for Electro Shields, I would normally recommend you take Bennett. But Bennett's going to be super helpful on the first side as well. So that means you'll need to think a bit more creatively about the the teams and characters you want to take. Anyway, let's take a look at the Millennial Pearl Seahorse. While the Lector doesn't have high electro resistance, this does. And for the first few seconds of combat, it has super resistance, meaning it takes basically no damage. It will then proceed to summon a Pearl worth 19 units of electro, and while it has this Pearl summoned, it has 90% resistance to all damage types. As we mentioned, you can't break this with Hydro because it doesn't get affected by Electro Charge. And on top of that, this Pearl has a super small hitbox. This means that only certain abilities will hit it. You can see this with Xiangling. When she casts her burst, the start of the animation, the hitbox is big enough to be able to hit the Pearl. But once the Pyronado is summoned and spinning around you, it's too low to be able to hit the Pearl, and so won't do any damage to it. The same thing applies to lots of abilities in the game. When Chaska targets it, she's only targeting the center of the Seahorse, meaning all of those attacks don't hit the Pearl. The same exact thing applies to Nahida's mark. The best ways to then deal with this are big hitbox attacks, or burning can be really effective against it, as the Pyro Aura will end up triggering a lot of overloads on the Pearl itself. But unfortunately for this Abyss specifically, it's unlikely you'll want to take burning, as you'll notice when we go over the last boss, unless you're doing a non-continuous run. Hopefully you manage to damage the Pearl enough, and when it goes to 7 units or below, it will start a main mechanic. For this mechanic, the Seahorse will jump into the air, making it really hard to target. If the Pearl has a tiny amount of its health bar left, you can try to target the Seahorse while it's in the sky, and breaking that will cause it to float down. But for the mechanic, it will proceed to summon 3 hearts around the arena. All of these hearts have electro wards worth 0.4 units, so they're really easy to break. Destroying each one of these hearts causes the Pearl to lose a third of its remaining health, and you'll have 15 seconds to break all 3 of them. On top of that, while you're trying to break these, you'll get hit by electro attacks from the Seahorse. These attacks are a lot like the ones that the Yumkasaur did, where they'll leave behind a mark on the ground and apply electro to you. As they fire where you're standing, if you run through the middle of the arena where the Seahorse will then fall down later, and you're playing something like a Hyper Bloom team, that electro that's on the ground can instead trigger those Hyper Blooms, stealing them away from you, which will inhibit a lot of your damage. So just be careful of where you run while this mechanic's going on. If you don't manage to complete this mechanic in time, for each of the hearts remaining, the Pearl will regain a third of its maximum HP, and it will also gain another 2 units for each heart remaining, meaning it can end up with more than it started with. On the other hand, if you break all of the hearts, it will break the Pearl, and whether you break the Pearl through this mechanic or just at another time in the fight, the Seahorse then becomes paralyzed for about 5 seconds. The more important factor though is that it's lost this Pearl now, meaning it loses all of those resistances it had gained. After about 20 seconds of having low resistances, it will resummon the Pearl, but if you broke it the second time it's summoned, it has a much lower health bar, only about 2/3 of what it started with. Okay, on to Chamber 3. On the first side, we have 3 mechs into a boss. The first 3 enemies you'll be facing are Harvester mechs. They have no particular resistances. The mechs don't have many mechanics, but you can apply Osea to them to disable their elemental infusion. While this does technically just make their attacks weaker for 25 seconds with one application, it stops them from being really annoying. These mechs like to drive off in one direction and go really far, and because they're positioned slightly apart and they aim at you, they'll go really far apart, ungrouping themselves. The best way to mitigate this is to just go far away from them. Then they'll all end up charging towards you and end up in a similar location, grouping themselves again. And after that, we're facing our third boss this side. And this time we're fighting one we haven't seen in a little while, part of the Icewind Suite, the nemesis of Coppelius. This is the version where the male mech stays in the center of the arena and the female mech dances around the outside. Nemesis of Coppelius isn't too complicated as a boss fight. The only significant mechanic is when they combine in the center of the arena. Here, Coppelius will summon a Cryo ward on himself, surprisingly worth 8 units, so all of the wards in this section across this half are worth 8 units. You can break it with Pyro Electro or a single unit of Osea. Combining with that, if you also hit this pair with Osea 3 times, they will become paralyzed for about 5 seconds. There's quite a few characters that you can use usefully on this first side and apply Osea, like Chevreuse, Clorand, and Navia. When Coppelius releases Coppelia and she goes off spinning around the edge of the arena, she can do some quite hard-hitting wind blades, so just try to be aware of that. Okay, and lastly, the boss that you're probably all here for, the Cryo Automaton, otherwise known as the Secret Source Automaton Overseer device. But you see now, there's 2 different bosses called Secret Source Automaton, and it's really confusing. So this is the Cryo Automaton, and I'll explain why. For this boss in particular, it has different requirements to a lot of bosses previously. Here you need really high rates of cryo hits. This is because soon into combat it will start its main mechanic called Sweeper Mode. Here it gains 210 resistance, and this will last about 30 seconds. This means essentially you're doing next to no damage to it if you don't complete this mechanic in one way or another. As a side note, you can extend this mechanic up to 40 seconds with hit lag, which is when you're doing melee attacks to an enemy. So Ayaka can do it, but Nervler won't be able to. Anyway, getting back to the mechanic, it starts with this flow momentum meter, which is just one of those meters like the lava statue or the terror shroom. Here it starts at 32 points and gains 2 points every 0.4 seconds, but it's much easier to remember, it's just 5 every second. And this goes up to a maximum of 135 points. During this mechanic, it has 2 beams that it shoots out to the side, and as these points increase, the beams start to spin faster and do more damage. Once it reaches 120 points, you get 4 of these beams, and these are really deadly, so it's important if you can to keep this meter low just for that reason. The beams even destroy things like Zhongli's pillar and can hit most hovering characters unless you're really high like Chaska. The way that you decrease this meter is from cryo hits. A cryo damaging hit, so not something like an Ayaka dash, but an attack or an ability, or even cryo reactions like a cryo swirl or a superconduct will reduce this meter by 4 points. You don't have to worry about ICD here, different amounts of cryo application won't affect this whatsoever, it's just a cryo hit. But that means that you have to do this quite often to keep this bar down, you have to be able to hit more than once a second. This means even characters with a really good amount of off-field cryo hits like Citlali or Escoffier won't be enough to decrease this meter all on their own, though they do certainly stop the rate that it's increasing. So what you need to decrease this bar is lots of frequent cryo hits to make it go to less than 10 points. You can do this in a lot of ways. You can use a cryo on fielder. Someone like Wriothesley attacks more than enough to be able to deplete that bar. You can get multiple off-field cryo units, like a combination of Rosaria and Layla together should have more than enough. Or you can take a character like Citlali that's doing 1 hit a second themselves, and then on-field them to combine their attacks and their off-field application to decrease this bar fast enough. You want to do all of this because specifically when it goes below 10 points, not only do the beams stop attacking and moving, but its resistances go down from 210% to 0. And even more than that, the cryo resistance drops even further, I think down to minus 40%. The meter will try to continually creep up, and if it gets above 10, everything will get reactivated. If you're playing with a character like Citlali and used her on field to decrease that bar, switching off her will still delay the amount of time it takes to increase. It will still take 10 seconds for it to reach 10 points, which gives you a good amount of time to do lots of damage. So essentially, lots of cryo hits, though there is an alternate method to get around this mechanic. It actually has a second hidden meter to it, which is the glowing runes around the outside. If you have a character in Night Soul, it detects this and slowly fills up this meter. This meter starts at 0 and gains 30 whenever a character enters the Night Soul Blessing state. The meter gains 10 more points per character in the state, caps out at 180. So with 3 characters, it just takes 3 seconds to fill this up. Once that meter's reached the max, it will change form to show you that it's activated. And then instead of its resistances dropping down to 0, its resistances all drop down to 50, so it's not as big, but it's still more than functional. It will also start doing a different attack style, so you don't have to worry about the beams as much. Just as a side note as well, if you're running like a Citlali in a cryo team, even activating this mode doesn't mean that you won't be able to also trigger the cryo resistance debuff at the same time. In this mode, if you're applying enough cryo, it will still drop its resistances down further. But this is another way of dealing with this enemy if you don't want to use cryo. Just like most bosses, after it's completed this mechanic, it will do 4 regular attacks before starting this mechanic again. Hopefully that explains everything for the enemies and we can start looking at the teams I recommend. Of course, as I say every time, the teams I mention here are not the only options, they're just what I consider to be the more convenient teams based upon the challenges the Abyss has given us. I more than encourage you to come up with interesting ideas and play what you like, and there's a whole lot of great creators out there that do amazing example clears every time the new Abyss drops. I'll put just a few suggestions on screen. But let's try taking a look at doing a continuous run, and let's have a look at First Sight specifically. So because of the Abyss Blessing, we'd quite like some cryo damage in our teams, and the Ley Line Disorder basically only benefits mavuika. You won't want cryo or dendro as your main source of damage because 2 bosses have resistance to it, and 2 of the chambers want you to break cryo wards and 1 of the chambers wants you to bring pyro. So we'll definitely want to bring some pyro to deal with most of these enemies. So really, anything with a good amount of pyro in the team can work, and especially Bennett. If you haven't heard me mention him already, Bennett is amazing at dealing with any pyro application checks. This is because his skill has a really short cooldown and applies 2 units of pyro, whereas most attacks and abilities in the game only apply 1. His burst activation damage also applies 2 units of pyro, and his C6 infuses your attacks with pyro, meaning you can enable any character to do pyro application. Beyond bringing the pyro and avoiding the resistances, there's not too many restrictions, so I'm not going to be heavy on suggestions for this side. Of course, Mavuika Melt is going to be crazy. You get the big damage buff on her from the Ley Line. Citlali is really good at dealing with the Spiritspeaker, and you can play Bennett in their team perfectly well, and you get an extra application from Mavuika. This is certainly the team that's the most shielded by a long way. But really, any Melt team will work, because you've still got plenty of pyro in that team, and you're getting the cryo reactions. I wouldn't recommend reverse Melt, even though you bring pyro application, just because that relies more on cryo damage, which the first chamber has really high resistances to. As that first requirement is just bringing pyro, overload teams and mono pyro teams should work. Chevreuse is the core of the electro teams, but you're also bringing lots of pyro and electro, which are great for breaking cryo wards. Any vaporize or reverse vaporize team like Child or Mualani should also be good. Again, you have plenty of pyro. You probably could take an electro team if you're bringing an Animo character who's able to swirl pyro off themselves and you have lots of electro application. Kazuha won't really work great with Veressa, but Cloran, Fischl, and Kazuha are a good combo. Now let's take a look at side 2. Again, we have the Blessing for the cryo damage, but here we also have the Ley Line Disorder for the cryo normal attack damage. We need to be really good at breaking electro wards. To be able to break the wards on the Lector and the Seahorse, we need some way of dealing with the Cryo Automaton, whether that's lots of cryo characters or lots of Night Soul characters. So the most shield team is obviously a Skirk team, which is a freeze team. This will be the easiest by far to complete this side with. If you have Escoffia, Farina, and then you can slot in a crazy amount of different characters, from Shenhe to Yalan to Jincho to Mona, etc, etc. Really, any freeze team will be pretty competent. If you don't want to run a freeze team though, any kind of melt team should be fine. Still have plenty of pyro and cryo, which are good at dealing with the electro wards. The condition being that if you're playing a forward melt team, something like Garming, you'll want to have 2 cryo units so you have enough cryo hits for the automaton. And you don't have to worry about that too much for a reverse melt team, because then you're on-fielding something like Wriothesley or Ganyu, who can do enough hits on their own. Going back to freeze, on a similar tangent, you probably could also do some variation of mono cryo, where you just have cryo characters. That still has lots of cryo application, but it does less damage generally, so you'll need stronger characters to compensate. I'm sure there's some orientation of Hyper Fridge that you could do, which is Hyper Bloom, but with a cryo character inserted in there. That's because the cryo character doesn't really negatively affect the amount of Hyper Blooms you're generating, and so you can use them for completing the mechanics. Though because there's only 1 slot available, because you need the Electro, Dendro, and Hydro for Hyper Bloom, you're restricted to either taking an on-fielder that's then not going to get many buffs from the team, or you take an off-fielder that you can on-field like Citlali or Charlotte, or you take someone like Chongyun who can enable your other characters to apply cryo. Your other option is you take lots of Night Soul characters, so Natlan characters, and you rely on that mechanic for the Cryo Automaton, completely ignoring the cryo mechanic. Someone like Kanich should still be able to do this. Together with that, Burning is also great against the Millennial Pearl Seahorse, and plenty of Dendro and Pyro make the Abyss Lector a cinch. Mualani, Mavuika, Chaska can all do similar things here. The requirement being that you're going to want to take at least 2 of these Natlan characters. So if you're doing a Mavuika team, say an Overload team, you want to take Mavuika and Auron. Maybe you could put Pyro Main Carry in there as a support as well. Or for Kanich, you'd take Pyro Main Carry and Ian-san as supports. The other annoying part to this is that for a lot of those Natlan teams and the Melt teams, so not the Freeze teams on this side, they really like Bennett, and Bennett's already really good on the first side. So there's going to be a lot of competition for him this Abyss. If you do have Ian-san, you can use her on the second side, but again, you still want Pyro application in those teams. So both sides have requirements for elemental application checks, and both of them can use Pyro characters. So there's then a lot of competition for characters that are good at doing that. So you're going to have to think quite creatively about the teams that you'll be making to clear this Abyss. And if you need more help with that, you're more than welcome to ask in the comments. I try to respond to as many as I can. Or as it's the end of the video and I'm allowed to plug these things, you can come ask in my Discord or in my Twitch where I rarely stream. But I should really be saying at the end of the video, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you enjoyed yourselves and you learned a thing or two. Maybe you enjoyed it so much you consider leaving a like or subscribing so you can catch this stuff next time. And when I do the guides for the new endgame, maybe even to the point where you're like, wow, this was a good quality video. I've never heard of this creator before. Maybe there's some friends that I have that would also find these kind of videos useful and you could send it to them. Okay, I'll stop with the self-promo now. If you have any more questions, suggestions, or thoughts, feel free to ask them in the comments, and I wish you best of luck. Oh, I should also say thank you for the incredible support on the last guide. It got way more views than I could have ever expected. I hope this one's just as fun. Bye!